because I want to talk about what the rest of the semester looks like. I am still grading the final drafts of the racism in nursing. I basically slacked off all of the Thanksgiving break and didn't grade any of your papers. But I'm grading them now, and just give me a few days, and I'm getting through those faster because I'm not giving detailed comments back on papers. Everybody will get a comment if you lose points, like I'll explain why, but I'm not giving detailed comments since we're not doing any more drafts of this paper. But you do have one last thing to do for this class. Today we'll finish talking about Roe v. Wade, and then what we have left is the final paper. So I'm going to say this, even though I know most of you already know this, but in case I have any freshmen in the class that this is their first semester at Cal State LA, we only have this week, next week, and then it's final exams week. For final exams week, I want to be clear that we don't meet that week. If you're new to the university schedule, this sounds weird, but instead, what you do that at final exams week is just attend the final exam if you're having a final exam in each of your classes. So in this class, we're not having a sit-down exam that you have to take. Instead, you just submit your final paper. Normally, if we were having a final exam, our final would be on December 15th, so Thursday of final exams week. So that's when I have that paper due, Thursday. I'll get back to talking about the paper in a second. So in the meantime, I want to give you time to watch the documentary if you haven't already. So what I'm going to do is cancel 2 classes. The documentary is an hour and 20 something minutes. So one class time should be enough to get through almost all of it. But just to be fair, I'm giving you 2 class periods. So we're meeting today, but we're not meeting this Thursday. Instead, I'm saying if you don't have any other time in which you can watch this documentary, watch it Thursday during our class time, right? And you can get through most of it in one class period. And then next week on Tuesday, I'm giving you that day off as well to watch the documentary. We'll come back next Thursday. Next Thursday, we will meet so we can talk about that documentary. So all it is talking about the documentary and last comments on what you should be writing in your final paper. That's it. But if anybody wants to work on it early, like watch the documentary, write the paper, submit it, you can do that. You can be done with this class earlier. If not, you have until Thursday of final exam week to submit that paper. But let's see, the other thing of why I want to give those days off of no class is because a lot of people still haven't come to do the meeting with the professor with me. So if you haven't done that, that would be a good time to come in and get that meeting done. Most of the time it's taking 2-3 minutes to get those meetings done. Is just me checking up and making sure everything looks good and asking you a few questions, and then you're on your way. So it is painless and it is the easiest 10%. For the Belly of the Beast paper, again, the key is watching the documentary. The documentary is about the forced sterilizations of women in California prisons. So this is, again, in California. So you'll be able to use the class material we've talked about in the last few weeks, like the sterilization of the Latina women in Los Angeles. All of that relates to what's in the movie. 2 to 3 pages doesn't sound like a lot, but the key is your argument, right? You have to give an explanation as to why these kinds of things, the forced sterilizations, continue to occur. The case of the women in prison in California that were sterilized without their consent has not even been the last one. We'll talk more about it next week, but these forced sterilizations have continued to occur in the United States, even when they are already illegal. There are already laws that have prevented this kind of thing. The documentary will talk about that. In California, there was already a law, a federal law even, that prohibits any doctor from sterilizing someone in prison. And yet it happened. So the big question for your thesis is why? Is it racism? Is it sexism? Is it dehumanizing people that are in prison? Is it all of those things? What is it? Right? I don't need you to solve the problem of forced sterilizations, but we want to identify something of why these things keep happening. I will accept any citation method. I've included the information on how to cite the documentary that you'll need. So mostly what you need is the name of the director, which is Erica Cohn, and the documentary was released in 2020. To access it, I have the link in several places. It's in the module, but also in the prompt here. If you are not on campus when you watch it, you're going to have to sign in via your Cal State LA login information, right? If you're on campus, it won't ask you to do that. It'll take you directly to the video because Cal State LA has purchased a subscription to Canopy. Let me sign in here. I keep checking it to make sure it works, but so if there are any issues, if anybody has any problem accessing it, let me know, because this documentary is not available for free in a lot of places. It's in Canopy. The PBS website used to have it. I haven't checked if they have it. You can't purchase it for like $2-3, but I don't want anybody having to pay. That was the point of using Canopy through the library, is that it's free. But again, any issues you want to let me know as soon as possible so that I can provide a workaround for that. I do have a rubric on here to do it. So any questions so far on the prompt or on the schedule for the next 2 weeks? No, okay, so I'll be sending out reminders, but I also have, like, if you forget which days do we have class, which days do we not have class, on Canvas in the modules, it says no class on Thursday. So we're meeting today, not on Thursday, and then we're meeting next Thursday. Also, all late work. There have been some people submitting late work, and right now I'm caught up with all the late work in classes. So I will accept late work up until December 9th. I have to do a cutoff because once final exam week comes around, I have to have time to grade all of those papers, and not just for this class, but for my other classes. So that's why I won't have time. I've already looked at my schedule and seen how many papers I have to grade. I won't have time to be going back and grading late work. I want to focus on getting final papers graded. In addition, for all of your professors, we have to submit final grades into the registrar by December 21st, which is the Wednesday after final exams, by like 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. And it's like a really set deadline. If we don't meet that deadline, we end up having to submit paperwork for every single student individually to get grades there. I never play it close to the deadline. I always submit my grades early. So your grades will all be visible on Canvas as soon as I finish grading your paper. You'll be able to see what your total grade in the class is. And I will actually be submitting grades into the registrar on Sunday. So I don't wait till Wednesday to submit things. This is the one thing where I will not procrastinate on. I submit things early. Some of your professors need those 3 days in the next week to get all their grading done. I just don't want, I never do that. So one, you should know that, but Mario, I see it. I see what you say. Yeah, the PowerPoint is up for today. And I am recording this. So I want to make sure that you all know kind of those logistics. I don't know if the registrar lets you know when grades are due. They are due Wednesday by like 8 or 9 a.m. And it's in every professor's best interest to have those grades in by that time. Any questions? How many pages, Diana? So it's 2 to 3 pages. You can go over the 3 pages. I think some people might want to go over. You want to cite the documentary, and then you want to use something from class. right? So whether it's the medical apartheid book or like the discussion of the No Más Bebés documentary or something we talked about in class, you want to use the material we discussed in class. This is not a research paper. You have to watch the documentary. You're not doing research on it. We're discussing the case in the documentary and why these things continue to occur. Yeah, so it's much shorter than the previous paper in here, but don't leave it to the last minute. Get it done. Okay. Then let's continue our discussion of the history of abortion and especially of Roe v. Wade, because what I have found, and this is now with over a decade of kind of researching and studying the history of abortion and having discussions with people about these things, that most of us don't read the Roe v. Wade decision. We don't know much about the case other than what gets discussed publicly. Right. And one of the most important things to me in talking about these issues is the individual stories of people that are affected by laws and by policies. And one of those key people when talking about the Roe v. Wade case is Norma McCorvey. I started talking about her before the break, but God knows most people probably we've all forgotten most of that. So to recap, she was Jane Roe. Her case was one of the couple of cases that were used to challenge a law in Texas that prohibited abortions. And that's the law that goes, or the challenge that goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It becomes the Roe v. Wade decision, which legalizes abortion in all of the United States. So in her story, she already had 2 children when she is pregnant for a 3rd time. This was her 3rd pregnancy. She tries to get an abortion and she cannot. She is denied an abortion and does something rare. When we studied people that get denied for an abortion, most people that are denied an abortion do end up carrying the pregnancies to term and end up keeping the babies. Norma actually gives up the baby for adoption. She really did not want a 3rd child. And by the way, now you can look up who that child was, and she's given an interview and things like that. But once the Roe v. Wade decision comes out from the Supreme Court in 1973, Norma reveals that she was Jane Roe. She comes out publicly and says that it is her. She joins the pro-choice movement and actually was a volunteer at an abortion clinic for some time, where she was a clinic escorting people in to protect them from the protesters outside of abortion clinics. Then she switches sides. She becomes pro-life, goes on television doing multiple interviews. It was a big deal because people knew who she was. So the first clip I'm going to show is of her talking to Larry King. Now, most of you, if you're young, you probably don't know who Larry King is, but he was one of these big talk show hosts on CNN. He hosted a show on CNN in which he interviewed people. I don't think he was a great interviewer. Like, he was always interrupting people, not letting them talk. And he was trying to get them to say something juicy or controversial. But I want you to pay attention to how she explains her positions and what you make of it, right? Because Larry King asks her about her trying to get an abortion at first and now being pro-life and what that means. So let's pay attention to what she says. And see what we make of it.
I want you to meet Jane Roe of the famed case Roe versus Wade. She is Norma McCorvey, and she's at our studios in New York. How, Norma, did you get to be Roe?
Well, basically, Larry, I just went to, I found myself pregnant for the 3rd time. I found out where an illegal abortion clinic was in Dallas. I went to it. It had been closed about a week before I'd gotten there. I went away. Then I told the attorney who was handling the adoption case that I thought I wanted to have an abortion.
Your baby was brought to term and adopted, right?
Yes, sir, it was.
So you never had an abortion?
No, sir, I never have.
And they then took you as their symbolic case to go to the court?
Yes, sir. But I didn't attend any of the court hearings or testify or anything like that.
Just knew you didn't want a baby.
Yes.
And why didn't you want a baby?
Well, I already had 2 babies. You know, I just really didn't want to bring another child into this world. I knew I couldn't take care of it.
And now your position is that it should go back to where it was? No
Well,
abortions?
Well, I would like to see Roe versus Wade overturned, but I'm not out trying to lobby any special interest groups or any legislators or senators, you know, to overturn it. The Lord's called me to open a crisis pregnancy center, and that's what I would like to do.
Why do you think, Norma, that a woman should not have the right that she now has? Why would you take that right away? You may think it is a sin, you may think it's wrong, they may even be sad, but don't they have the right to be sad?
They do have the right to be sad if they choose to. You know, it's a very sad thing when a woman wakes up in the middle of the night and she calls a clinic and she says, I want the baby.
But the woman who doesn't do that, does she have the right to have an abortion?
I don't really feel like she really wants that abortion. I think
then will you not, if let's say we overturn it, do you fear the return of that clinic that closed in Dallas, the illegal one? Won't they come back?
I'm sure they will, Larry. I'm sure they will.
Why would you want that?
Well, I wouldn't want that. See, that's what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, there's no sense in putting yourself or a woman through that kind of circumstances because it's not really necessary.
Okay, so what do we make of it? Because I think a couple of things. I feel like she does do at least partway decent job of explaining why she wanted the abortion in the first place. So then it's interesting too, in the same interview, for her to then say, no, like people don't actually want abortions. So what did you make of it? What do you think is going on with her? Do you think she's clear in her positions? Do you think she's wishy-washy or unclear? Like I said, she's not clear. Lots of dancing around it. In part because there is some of that, right? But like when he asks her, like, won't that clinic come back? Aren't people allowed? Why would you want to take that right? And she's kind of like, oh. Because yeah, Claudia, that's what struck me in this interview. I was like, she's actually the most clear, I think, when she's saying that, when she's saying, I did not want another baby. Like she did not. Yeah. And it is kind of contradictory, or a bit hypocritical of her to clearly explain why she didn't want one and then say, no, people don't actually want abortions. We'll talk about how that's actually quite common in people who are pro-life and seek abortions. She changed her mind. Stephanie's asking an interesting question. Why did she change her mind? I will get to that. That is the next clip. So towards the end of her life, she died a couple of years ago. She allowed a documentary crew to come in and film her. And she'll reveal, you'll see in the clip I'll show you, that she was faking it. She was lying about being pro-life. And in the clip I'm going to show you, you're going to see one of the men she worked with at the pro-life organization she was most closely aligned with. And you're going to see his reaction to hearing her talk about saying she was lying. And then they're interviewing some of the women, the feminists she had worked with also in the pro-choice movement. So she had been part of both movements. And then when you see her, she knew she was dying, and this is at the very end of her life. Like she literally passed away within weeks of the crew filming the interviews with her. So let me go to that. Oh yeah, Claudia, for her to say that people don't want abortions is very weird. Yeah. Yeah. So this is these are the same interviews I had used that I had used before. Yeah. So let's watch this one, and then we can talk about what jumped out at you from this interview.
Did they use you as a trophy?
Of course. I was the big fish. I was the big fish.
Do you think they would say that you used them?
Well, I think it was a mutual thing. You know, I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say, and that's what I'd say.
Wow.
I took their money and they put me out in front of the cameras and told me what to say. That's what I'd say.
Wow. Give me an example of what you'd say.
We've gathered here today to pay homage to the children that are being aborted in this abortuary. We're doing this because abortion is wrong. And I, as the former Jane Roe of Roe versus Wade, do regret signing the affidavit for the pro-abortion camps. That was probably about it.
It was all an act.
Yeah. I did it well, too. I am a good actress. Of course, I'm not acting now. I did it well, too.
That really hurts because Jake's it's big stakes. It's just really big stakes.
I had never heard her say anything like this. Never. But I knew what we were doing. And there were times I was sure she knew. And I wondered, is she playing us? What I didn't have the guts to say was, because I know damn well we're playing her. What we did with Norma was highly unethical. The jig is up.
So yeah, that's kind of scary. It's so that the male that was being interviewed, I forget his name, in his declarations are actually probably even more shocking. He was a member of the pro-life movement. And he's the one that says, yeah, we were using her. And if anybody's interested in that documentary, he discusses some of the tactics that they use in a very kind of cynical way. So it's very interesting. And Claudia says she probably had an effect with many women, and it was all media and money based. So did you all catch that? Because she talks about how it was a mutual relationship. She acknowledges that they used her, and they did. The organization that she was working with put her up in front of cameras. Like, they made a big deal out of Jane Roe has changed her mind. She is no longer pro-choice, and she wants Roe v. Wade to be overturned. Right. And you can see why people would care what Jane Roe thought when it's such a dramatic change in positions. You typically don't see that kind of extreme change of going from one extreme to another. People change their minds, but usually not in the manner that she had. But did you all catch why she did it? Why she changed her sides? Yeah, Stephanie, she did it because of money. In the documentary, she explains further that initially when she came out and revealed herself as Jane Roe, it seems clear to me that she thought she was going to gain financially from it. And she did it. Most of the time, like if you're being interviewed by CNN or any legitimate news organizations, they usually don't pay for their interviews. So, and the pro-choice organizations were unwilling to pay her for any of work she was doing, or any of the activism she was doing. It's all typically volunteer work unless you hold an official position a paid position within an organization. And she was a working class woman with not a lot of education. By revealing she was Jane Roe, she probably also very much limited the kinds of jobs she could have, because she becomes a public figure. Everybody knows her name. She wasn't making any money. She was having a hard time feeding her family. So the pro-life groups offered her money. And she asks them for money. She discusses in the documentary. She asked them for money, and they were willing to give it to her. Now, the organization, they do interview people that didn't leave the organization, and they explain it as charity work. They were paying her as part of their charitable efforts, that they were not paying her to give interviews, that they were just helping her out. So if you're interested, the documentary is called AKA Jane Roe. It's on Hulu. It's available on like Amazon or YouTube for paid, but don't pay for it. It's available for free on Hulu if you have a subscription or you know somebody who has access to it. I don't know. Do you think it matters what the person who is Jane Roe, what her political position is or was? Robert says no. Anybody else? What do you think? Does it matter what her position was? It probably doesn't change your mind on whatever your position is, right? But this is the problem when like somebody becomes the face of something. Yeah, the thing to consider, Stephanie's making a good point of like, but some people might have listened to her. She might have given people hope, false hope, since it wasn't her genuine position. She was she was promoting on television. It's really interesting, but this is also why I'm like, oof, when I've looked at individuals that become the face of a movement, especially when it comes to the issue of abortion anywhere in the world. I've looked at several cases all over the world. Their lives don't, like, becoming the face of a movement doesn't end up helping financially, career-wise, in a lot of those ways. So it's not a quick, get rich scheme. It's not a good way to make money. Maybe if she had existed, if the Roe v. Wade had occurred now, maybe through social media, she would be making money. She could be making videos on YouTube or TikTok. But she didn't make a ton of money. Even the money she was getting from the pro-life organization was like just barely enough, it seems like. So anyway, I think people's individual stories matter. And so I wanted to share that, her story with you all. Now, the actual case of Roe v. Wade, most of us don't read the decision, right? The Supreme Court decisions are written in legal language. So a lot of us are not going to spend time reading them. Some of them can be long. We rely on experts, on legal experts who translate these decisions for us. But it's worth spending a little bit of time on some parts of the Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision, because what they say about history is really interesting, right? So in the Roe v. Wade decision, which legalized abortion in the United States, and I have to say, the Roe v. Wade decision itself was one of the most expansive laws in the world at the time in 1973. At that time, Britain had legalized abortion, and other countries were in the process of legalizing abortion. But in most places in the world where abortion is legal, there is a legal limit on it, whether it be like 15 weeks, 20 weeks, 21 weeks, wherever it is. Sometimes laws usually put a limit on it. The Roe v. Wade decision did not put a limit on it. It just it said there's a constitutional right to an abortion. And part of it was in the right to privacy in the Constitution. However, after the Roe v. Wade decision, what the Supreme Court said was that states could put reasonable limits limits on that. And that's why you have seen in like the last 10 years, states all over the country had been trying to test the limits of Roe v. Wade. Like, what is a reasonable prohibition in it, right? And that's why Texas, even before the overturn of Roe v. Wade, had been passing laws that basically made abortion illegal. By making like 7 weeks the cutoff time, or 4 weeks the cutoff time, as some states have been trying to do, it makes abortion basically illegal because most people don't even know that they're pregnant at 4 or 7 weeks. But regardless, the Roe v. Wade decision, it's what it says about the history is really interesting. So this is in section 6, right? So let me read just a couple of sentences here. It said, it perhaps is not generally appreciated that the restrictive criminal abortion laws in effect in a majority of states today are of relatively recent vintage. So that was true, right? That in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court was accurately saying that most laws that restricted abortion in the United States had been recent, right? We saw a couple of weeks ago how most of those laws had been passed around the time of the Civil War, 1960, 1964. That's when states began passing laws. Before that, there were no laws in the United States that restricted abortion. Like there just weren't laws on the issue. Then the Supreme Court says those laws generally prescribing abortion or its attempt at any time during pregnancy, except when necessary to preserve the pregnant woman's life, are not of ancient or even common law origin. Again, that's true. A lot of American law is based on English common law. And English common law allowed abortions for the life of the mother and up to a certain period in the pregnancy. The other interesting thing, though, is that the Supreme Court is bringing up ancient history, and it actually dedicates a section to talking about ancient history, right? Like there's a section called Ancient Attitudes, where the Supreme Court says these are not capable of precise determination. Well, we actually do have a really good idea of what ancient people did when it came to abortion. But then they say, we are told that at the time of the Persian Empire, abortifacients were known and that criminal abortions were severely punished. We are also told, however, that abortion was practiced in Greek times, as well as in the Roman era, and that it was resorted to without scruple. So that is, to me, is really interesting. Like they cite what the Persian Empire did. There were some restrictions on abortion in the Persian Empire, but then they say, but the Greeks and the Romans had no restriction on abortion. And they're going to give more weight to what the Greeks and the Romans did. Why? Why do you think the Supreme Court, the decision was in 1973. Why would the Supreme Court in 1973 cared what the Greeks and the Romans did? Coming up in the chat. Western chauvinism. Yeah, it's actually based on this really wrong idea that American history has a direct connection to Greek and Roman history. I actually think that's a wrong connection. One, the Romans didn't have democracy, period. The Greeks, only one city-state had democracy, Athenians, and it was a limited democracy, but okay, it was the Athenians had it. Well, the Athenian Empire falls. After that, you have the rise of the Roman Empire, and it was influenced by the Greek world. But then when Rome falls, Western Europe loses its connection to Rome. Like literally, it enters a completely different period. Most of the Roman Empire does not survive in Western Europe. Like there's a complete cutoff time. But people in Western Europe and the United States like to bring up their connection to Greece and Rome, even though that connection is artificial. We created that connection in the present. It didn't exist in this after the fall of Rome. But we do have a lot of information on what the Greeks and the Romans were doing in terms of abortion. Some of it through written documents. A lot of Greek and Roman documents were preserved by Muslim scholars, which is how we know, but we have Greek and Roman medical texts that have like recipes on how to induce an abortion, that have instruments that would have been used to induce an abortion. We know, for example, in places like Sparta, right, where they were having small families, that, okay, if they're having small families, how are they limiting the size of the family, right? Same thing in Rome. We're able to tell through cemeteries, largely in Rome, the size of the families. And we can see that they had small families. And so the question for historians then was, what did they do? What were they doing? They did have different ways of trying to prevent a pregnancy, but it is also clear that in ancient times that some people used abortion as a form of birth control because medical birth control didn't exist, right? So abortion was widely practiced. In the Roman Empire, there was no law prohibiting abortion, not until Christianity emerges. And it's not until much later, until the Christianity is adopted, that there are laws. Initially, in fact, the male head of household had complete control over the family to the point where he could commit infanticide. A father or the male head of household could kill a newborn infant without any legal problem. Like, that's how much control the male head of household had, how much legal rights he had over the family. But abortion, we do have evidence that it was widely practiced in ancient times. So, okay, if we're going to make a connection, even though I think it's not a legitimate connection, but all right, if we're going to make a connection to the Greeks and the Romans, then they allowed abortion. No restrictions until Christianity started influencing laws. So that was very interesting for the Supreme Court to cite those. If you want to read the complete decision, I do have a link to it here. But just as interesting is then that in the most recent Dobbs decision, it's Dobbs v. Jackson, but it's been called just Dobbs all over social media and the news. The Supreme Court this year said that there's no constitutional right to an abortion, right? It says, the first sentence is, the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. What this does is it send the question of abortion to the states then. Basically, if there's no right to it in abortion, then states get to decide what the abortion law is in their territories. And that's why now you see a patchwork of different laws. You have places like California where abortion is legal, and we just voted to protect that right in the California Constitution. Other places like New York, for example, also allows abortions very widely. But then you have places like Texas and Mississippi that have some of the most restrictive abortion laws, where pretty much there's no option for an abortion in those places, even in cases of the mother's health is in danger, or the cases of rape and incest. I don't know if anybody has been paying attention, but some of that has already come up as a significant issue in some of these states. Some organizations have been helping minors go out of state for legal abortions because they can't get them in certain places. The other problem with some of these really restrictive laws is miscarriages. Miscarriages look like abortions. In fact, medically, there's no way to distinguish between a miscarriage and an abortion. Like, the process it looks the same. And it's a problem because normally if things go like as typically, if things go well during a miscarriage, the miscarriage occurs, the body expels everything that's inside the uterus, like everything has to come out. You can't leave any fetal tissue inside the uterus. If anything remains, it can lead to an infection and to death, right? And so sometimes during a miscarriage, you have to go in and perform what is technically an abortion, a D&C. That's the medical, like, surgical procedure that is an abortion. And that's what's been the biggest problem most recently that we know of in states like Texas and Ohio and Mississippi, is people trying to get the D&C to after a miscarriage, that doctors, hospitals, and pharmacists are unwilling to perform the abortions. They're having to go to the lawyers first. And that can be really dangerous because you don't know how quickly an infection can move. Sometimes you might have a little bit of wiggle room, and other times you might not. An infection can move really quickly and kill someone while you're waiting for the doctor or for the lawyers to decide whether the procedure can be performed or not, or whether the pharmacist will actually give you the prescription to the pills needed to complete the miscarriage. That's what's causing a lot of chaos all over the country right now. And then the court in the Dobbs decision actually cites the history as well, right? In fact, it says in number 2, it says, next, the court examines whether the right to obtain an abortion is rooted in the nation's history and tradition, and whether it is an essential component of ordered liberty. The court finds that the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. That was really interesting to me because it contradicts what the Supreme Court said in Roe v. Wade, right? Which leads us to think then, okay, this court's interpretation of what history and tradition is different. We know that abortions have occurred in the United States before it was the United States, but ever since it's been the United States, that abortion has existed, that laws restricting it didn't come about until late into the 19th century. So what do you think the Dobbs court meant when it said there is no deeply rooted history in our country of abortion? Are they just lying to us? Or is their interpretation of history and tradition different? What do we think? Because I'm thinking, right, and this is not, we're not talking about the legal aspects. I think when they're talking about tradition, they're not saying it here, but I think when they talk about history and tradition, they don't mean secular history and tradition. I think they're interpreting it as religious tradition. And by knowing what some of the justices are very religious and Christian, I think is part of why I think their interpretation of history and tradition is Christian history and tradition. But what historians of religion and of abortion will tell you is that actually religion's approach to abortion is not clear-cut, right? Most of us think, when we've been trained to think, that religion is against abortion, right? Especially Christianity, very much against abortion. Well, that's not really true. Some religious groups, some religious interpretations are very strictly against abortion. That is true. But when you look at overall religious traditions, it's much more complicated. For example, Judaism, right? For Jews, abortions are permitted. Why? Well, part of it is what Christians, Jews, and Muslims have done is look at religious documents, right? At the Bible, at what the prophets were interpreted as the word of God. And it turns out for Jews and Christians, at least in the Old Testament and the New Testament in the Bible, abortion is not mentioned. Like the word abortion does not come up. Instead, then, because there's not a direct order on what to do on abortion, what scholars had to do was interpret different passages in the Bible that might be related. And they're choosing what's related and what's not. But for example, for a lot of Jews, one of the key sentences is the order from God to multiply and populate the earth. Those are not the exact words, but that's essentially the order, right? That in the Old Testament, God gives humans the order that you have to procreate and populate the earth. Well, Jewish scholars sat and offered their interpretation of that, because what does it mean to be given the order to procreate, right? Does it mean you just have to have one child and then you're done? You have fulfilled your duty to God? Some religious scholars, some Jewish scholars said, yeah, because the wording in the Bible is not clear. It doesn't specify how many children you need to have. Then one's good enough. Other Jewish scholars said, no, you need to have a boy and a girl. Once you have a boy and a girl, then you fulfilled God's order and you're done. And so it was so open to interpretation. Regardless, though, of the way any scholar interpreted it, was still like, okay, you don't have to keep having children forever until you can't. You can limit the size of your family. As a result, then contraception and abortions are allowed in Jewish tradition. And in fact, in all except the most orthodox of Jewish groups, abortions are very much allowed. Same thing for Muslims. In interpretations of the Prophet's words, Prophet Muhammad's words, there is room for abortions to be allowed. It is in conversation with leaders that an abortion can occur, but they're especially allowed in when the mother's life is in danger, in kind of those kinds of extreme situations. They're very much allowed. Though it also depends on the Muslim community. For Christians, the same thing is occurring. Different Christian groups have taken different positions on it. And even within some of the most restrictive groups like Catholics, for Catholics, the Pope, like the Vatican, is very clear. Abortions are not allowed, and they are a kind of mortal sin. Up until recently, once you had an abortion, you couldn't even go up to receive communion, or you were not supposed to. Like, it's not something that could be forgiven, was the idea. They've changed some of those laws recently, but still, practicing Catholics are not supposed to get abortions. Well, not all Catholics agree. Not all Catholics agree. And in the US, there's actually a significant history of Catholics ignoring the Vatican on a whole slew of issues. Medical contraception, for example, is also not allowed for practicing Catholics. And yet American Catholics, a vast majority of American Catholics, use medical contraception. In the last poll before the Dobbs decision, 68% of Catholics supported Roe v. Wade. And that's really interesting because it hits on a group of people that is quite important in the pro-choice coalition, right? The pro-choice political position is actually made up of people with a lot of different opinions on it. And one of the biggest groups within that coalition is the people who are like a lot of these Catholics, who believe that abortion is wrong, would not have one themselves, would not approve of anybody in their life having an abortion, but believe the law should allow abortions to occur. Like, I would never have one, but it should be legal. That's what a lot of these people believe. One of those people is actually Biden. I used to use him as an example a lot because for a long time, he's been very open about being a practicing Catholic who does not approve of abortions. He thinks they're a sin, but believes that the law, that they should be legal. And that's actually one of the reasons why he's been disappointing pro-choice activists a lot right now. Like he won't even say the word abortion in public. You have not, while he's been president, you have not heard him say the word abortion. His representatives will not, most of the time, not say the word abortion either. Why? He's been disappointing a lot of people on that thing, and it's like, wait a minute, it's because he wants nothing to do with the political debate about abortion. Partly, I suspect, because of his personal views on abortion. So it's really interesting to see some of this play out. The other thing that brings up the case of Norma McCorvey too is the group of people who are pro-life and have had abortions. So we've done studies of these people now. There was a really important study done a couple of years ago called the Turnaway Study, which studied what happened when women in particular were denied an abortion in the US, because that was already happening in the US. So they followed these women over the course of years to see what happened to their lives. What they found in those group of people that they were studying was that there were pro-life women getting abortions. And it seems to be like, wait a minute, something is happening here. What is happening? Why is somebody who is declaring that their political position is against abortion, why are they getting an abortion? And in almost all the cases, when asked, the women will reply that their case is separate, that their situation is different, that they're in a situation that requires an abortion, but they still believe abortion should be illegal for everyone. It's a really interesting case because it sounds like it's hypocritical or contradictory, like you're contradicting yourself. What are you talking about? And one, humans do this all the time, right? We contradict ourselves, we're hypocritical to rationalize our actions. And that seems to be what a lot of those women are doing, that they think their situation is different without thinking that maybe everybody has a situation that should be considered, but they won't change their opinion on how they vote. They won't change their opinion on the politicians they support and the political position they take publicly. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in terms of people's approaches to the topic. And this is why I'm like, I had started off the conversation a couple of weeks ago by saying, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind on it. I've learned that people rarely change their opinions on this topic. It's about understanding the history. And if you care about this topic at all, understanding the politics of it involves understanding the kind of diversity in approaches that people take to the topic today. Obviously, I'll be paying attention to what's happening in the next few years on this topic. But do you all have any questions? I know sometimes the way we talk about this topic in public is really, it can be confusing, right? Like I think most people even today don't understand what the Dobbs decision did. Right. And I think it's created some confusion, especially for people seeking abortions that don't know, like, wait a minute, is it legal where I'm at? What do I need to be doing? How to approach these things? Oh, and then Robert had said, oh, the other thing was like people had done it for a long time, but wasn't public. Yeah, that was the other thing about abortions, because even when they're legal, they can be taboo, or just people don't talk about it. And so a lot of things, like one of the things some organizations are doing today is trying to get people to talk about their abortions, to destigmatize it. Because when we look at the statistics of how many people have received abortions in this country, we can see that almost half of women have received abortions. That means that everybody knows somebody who has received an abortion. We don't talk about it. We're afraid of judgment, and as a result, we don't even know that people near us have gone through these situations. So no questions? So what do you think? Does the history of abortion, does it help reinforce your political opinion on it, or does it make no difference? Like I said, I don't think it changes anybody's opinion on it. So I'm like, I don't even ask if it changes. Yeah, I'm like, oftentimes it probably makes no difference, but it can enhance your opinion. I'm like, if you have a political take, understanding some of the history, I think it's important. Again, it doesn't have to change your opinion. It can give you more material to better understand your own position, regardless of what it is. Okay, I'll stop recording now.